right, everyone. Thank you for joining. I am back with a really fascinating class. I think so. I think this is going to be really, really special. This is going to be class 6 in Moshiach update for 2026, 5786. So fasten your seatbelts. This is going to be a ride. It's going to be enjoyable. It's going to be meaningful. It's going to be great. Tonight I'm happy that this class is coming out tonight because tonight or this past day was the 213th yahrzeit, day of passing of Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, which we had discussed so much in the last few classes about, other way. Here we go. Got to center myself. Here we go. Which we have discussed already in the past, how Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, the significance of him, of his establishment of Hasidism. We discussed in the previous classes how he opens up and lays the foundation for Moshiach, and he is a significant person in the return of the Davidic kingdom. He's the 8th generation to the Holy Maharal of Prague, and he is 7 generations before the Rebbe, before the Chabad Rebbe, the 7th Chabad Rebbe. And when the Rebbe opens up his famous, when the Rebbe assumed the mantle of leadership of Chabad in 1951, which we're going to commemorate its 75th anniversary in just 2-3 weeks, the Rebbe began by speaking about a chain of 7 holy people whose task is to bring God down into this world. And the first one of that chain is Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi. In that sense, he takes the place of Abraham, the first Jew. Because over there as well, from Abraham to Moses, Moses brings God down to the world for the first time, was also 7 righteous, saintly giants. Abraham being the first and 7th, and Moshe being the 7th. And here as well, we begin with Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, culminating in the Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose job is to bring the Geulah into this world, to bring redemption and to bring God down completely into full manifest and full revelation in this physical material world, which we shall see its completion, Bezrat Hashem, momentarily. In our last classes, and particularly I'll refer you to class number 4 and class number 5, we were talking about how this Davidic dynasty runs parallel. Like the example we've discussed earlier is that we know that the Jewish people in general are compared to the moon, but the Malchus Beis Dovid, the kingdom of David in particularly, is compared to the moon. The moon waxes and wanes. And when you think it disappeared, it's only making a comeback. It only returns. But the amount of time it takes from it to go from just being born, a new moon at the beginning of a new Hebrew month, to the full moon is between 14 and 15 days. And then it disappears also. It's time that it gets smaller and smaller till it disappears in the sky is another 15 days, 14 to 14 and a half, 15 days. So that's the cycle of 29 and a half days that make up the every moon cycle, lunar cycle. So the Zohar says the same is with the Jewish people as a whole and the Davidic kingdom in particularly, that it took 14 years for God's kingship, which is actualized only, God chooses only one family that could manifest his kingdom in this world. And that's, God chose King David. And then God promised kingship to him and his descendants for all of eternity. However, King David was the 14th to Abraham. And King Solomon was the 15th. And in King Solomon's reign was when God's kingship was fully established, because the Holy Temple was built in Jerusalem. And we had a city which was then Hashem's city in this world, God's city in this world. Then it was like 14, 15 generations until the remaining kings of Judah disappeared, the last of them being Tzidkiyahu. Now, there's a question of how you get to 14, 15, but the Zohar says that. And then it seems like when you count actually the kings, it seems to be more, but it's not the discussion of this class. Now it says it will return again, and Moshiach will be again the full moon. That means that throughout the exile, the kingdom of David goes kind of under it. It always is a present in the world, and they always have positions of leadership, but not necessarily as a powerful, visible force that people can identify who they are in a very visible way and recognize that this is an extraordinary family, that this is an extraordinary line. It does return at a certain point, right before 14 generations before the coming of Moshiach. The first one of that, the Abraham, so to speak, of that 14 line chain. Before we spoke Abraham as the beginning of a seven consecutive tzaddikim, but now we're talking about double that, 7 times 2, bringing it to 14, like King David was the 14th from Abraham, establishing God's kingship. For that, we go back 7 generations before Reb Schneur Zalman of Liadi. His father's father was the saintly Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy, the great rabbi. There's a statue of him in Prague, known to everybody. He was like the crown jewel of the city of Prague. Great philosopher, thinker, Kabbalist, Talmudist, incredible person, but also an enormous miracle worker, someone who is attributed to him that he created a human being, a golem, right? It says about him. And there's obviously a lot of discussion about that. So this is like super great. And he is the first generation. I'm not going to go into all that. We discussed it in other classes, but I'm trying to just set who the Alter Rebbe is, who we're commemorating his yahrzeit today. And one of the responsibilities of this family that begins to lay the foundations of redemption during the time of exile, and only Moshiach himself, who is like the 14th or the 15th, that period, the full moon, is the one who completes the job and brings about full redemption, just about where we are holding and standing right now in history. However, already before that, you have already the building blocks of rectification. And it comes in twofold. And this is what we discussed in last class, how you have to establish what's called tikkun olam, the rectification of the world. You have to lay the foundations of a rectified world. So the Alter Rebbe, in his philosophy, in his teachings, begins to rectify the world. He begins to speak of olam tikkun, of a world of rectification, inasmuch that he changes the entire scope or the entire direction of Judaism. The Judaism is not seeking spiritual bliss and ecstasy and an escape from the body, but rather the Alter Rebbe comes and turns the entire philosophy of Judaism on its head and says that the purpose of everything is the physical, the material world, which means it's all here and now. It's not in an afterlife. It's not in some other experience. God wants to have a home in this world. And the Alter Rebbe puts at the center of it Moshiach. Moshiach is when we realize that goal, when the world has reached a certain refinement and a certain purification and a certain elevation, that God can finally be fully revealed down here on earth, like he is going to be any moment, which means we will sense God's presence in this world exponentially, so powerfully that we can't even imagine how strong God's light and God's being will be felt in the material physical world. Now, we discussed in earlier classes that for that there has to be the world, humanity has to have a certain repair and refinement, which doesn't happen overnight. Everything is the idea of repairing this world comes in stages. It's a developmental type of a thing. It's a progress. So, but you have to start seeing some of that progress already before the full redemption. We discussed that's the world that, and to a certain degree, I'm sure there's much other things, is the United States of America. And we also discussed in the last class, why America? Why geographically the United States? Because it's the lower part of the world, the lower part of the globe. As the Alter Rebbe discussed the significance of the lower part of the world, we're trying to lift existence up from its lowest tier, from the lowest point. And the United States of America was always the lowest point. And if you think about it, the nature of human nature is when you give people material success. And when you give people independence, that usually inflates their ego, and the inflated ego usually rejects God. And those claims to have all of its successes and attributes to its own glory. That's what happens, and that's why the great Jewish rabbis felt that when Jews were coming to America, that is super dangerous, because just the opportunity of the United States giving the people and turning them into entrepreneurs and turning them into giving them autonomousness, giving them freedom, giving them an ability to be successful. Success can a lot of times breed greed, and it can breed a sense of arrogance and therefore a complete disconnect from God. So that's why the elevation of the United States of America, both to the Jews in the United States of America and the non-Jews in the United States of America, makes it even more super challenging. And therefore it's such a novelty that a nation was built on a belief on one God, a nation that is so charitable, a nation that is to a certain degree humble, and that is the beauty. That is extraordinarily magnificent. And what I was trying to do in the last two classes was to connect the Alter Rebbe and the 7 Chabad Rabbeim, and we showed certain points of contact with this developed United States world, which, as we discussed in the earlier classes, is reaching a major milestone, the 250th birthday. So that was the subject of the earlier classes. The subject of tonight's class is going to be, as this positive effect on the world is taking place. And again, America then turns to be a beacon of light. The light, what do they call the United States? The city on the hill. The light for the nations, kind of. And it brought democracy, and it brought the various different great qualities, and that spread all over the world in so many ways, that America affected the world in a positive way. I'm not saying that America is perfect, and we're not going into that. One has to be able to look deeper and not just get caught up with superficialities, but look at the essence, see where humanity was before the Declaration of Independence and America, and what kind of ruthless world there was, and to see where humanity has been moved in today's world. Okay. Now, while all of this is happening in the positive, there are also extremely negative forces that are obviously not going to sit well with the fact that the Moshiach is rolling out, that we're rolling out the red carpet for Moshiach. God created the world that there should be a battle, that it should be a war, and that there should be a constant competition between the forces of holiness and the forces of unholiness, and that eventually holiness is going to triumph over the unholy, and the unholiness is going to be banished from the face of the earth, as the verse says, the spirit of impurity, I'm going to remove from the earth. But it doesn't go without a fight. And its most ferocious and most intense battles, it leaves for the final battle when it's fighting for its life. So what I would like to do in the next class, which is this class, in this current class, is to follow the history of this battle, and to show how the last, in a sense, this great army or great force of darkness that was going to oppose Mashiach and Mashiach's development in this world begins with the Alter Rebbe. Because again, once the Alter Rebbe is laying the foundations of Chabad Hasidism and laying the foundations of permeating the oneness of God into matter, into the physical world, so he's upsetting a lot of klipot. Klipot means the impurities, the negative forces that have embedded themselves in the physical world and claimed ownership of the physical world, claim that the heavens are the heavens of God. There's a verse that says, the heavens are the heavens of God. They don't mind that God is shining in heaven, but they say earth belongs to the impure. Earth belongs to the non-believers, or earth belongs to that which is impure. So when the Alter Rebbe starts directing holy energy towards earth with power and with force that has never been before, we can imagine that in other words, he's beginning to evict the negative forces there's going to be a lot of pushback. And here is what we're going to talk about: a battle spanning about 200 years, not 250 years particularly. I wrote 250, but really it's around 200 years, in which there is a direct a direct war. It's a spiritual war, but it's manifesting itself also in physical forces in this world. And you can see that the Chabad leadership is right at the epicenter of this war. And the Chabad Rebbes, the 7 Rebbes, are literally conducting this heroic battle. And in the end, they triumph. And I'd like to share that thread with you today. So being that today is the yahrzeit of the Alter Rebbe, we begin with the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe passed away in the year 1812, on the 24th day of Teves, 1812, which corresponds to the Hebrew year 5573. Tov Kuf Ayin Gimel, 5573, 24. In the middle of the winter, in a town called Piena, which is it's a village in the Ukraine. What's the Alter Rebbe doing over there? He was living before that in the town of Liadi, and somewhere in White Russia, I think, or Belarus. I'm not exactly sure today where Liadi is. What's he doing in the middle of far, far away from his home in the city of Piena? That's because the Alter Rebbe escaped during the big, big battles when Napoleon's armies came in and thought to fight against the mighty Tsarist Russian, against the Tsar Alexander. And it was one of the bloodiest, this was the biggest war and the biggest battle of Napoleon. Eventually, Napoleon wasn't completely obliterated now, but this was the beginning of his eventual fall. Napoleon thought he would defeat the Russian army, but it didn't go his way. These battles happened in the year 1812. You can look this all up in your history and follow it. Now, the Alter Rebbe was very, very much in favor of the Tsar Alexander and of the Russian. The Alter Rebbe sided with the Russian army. In other words, he lent his support to Russia. Now, the Alter Rebbe lent his support to Russia not because the Russians were such righteous individuals and so kind and wonderful to the Jews. Anybody that knows the story of the Jewish people under Tsarist Russia knows that the Jewish people, it was non-stop pain, misery, and suffering. There was so much anti-Semitism, and there was such brutal treatment that the Russian Tsars treated their Jewish subjects that it's unbelievable. Why would the Alter Rebbe side with this evil, with this monster? The answer is it was the lesser of the two evils. Because Napoleon that was coming in, although Napoleon was promising emancipation, and Napoleon was promising a world, a modern world, a world that is not, where there won't be that oppression, where Jews will have far more freedoms. And not a question, it's very possible that Napoleons and the French the Jews would have been doing much better physically under Napoleon's domain, under his sovereignty, or under his, if he would have won this battle and kind of liberated Europe. However, the Alter Rebbe said it would come at an enormous spiritual cost. What would happen is Jews would be freed, but since Napoleon himself was such a non-believer, he was such a heretic, he was, and therefore he was the embodiment of the forces that completely removed the yoke of heaven. In other words, in terms of the forces in the world, including even the dark forces, let's differentiate. There are certain klipot, certain impure forces that at least have fear of God, have some degree of fear of God. But then there are that which is really, really dark, which doesn't have any fear of God at all, or at least is seeking down here in this world to remove the sense of divine, of God's sovereignty, of God's kingship from the world completely. Napoleon was the embodiment of that darkness. And therefore, we have to realize when a certain person is a ruler and a king, he gives off vibrations. He gives off certain energies into the air. In addition to the fact that by liberating the Jews at that point, when the Jews were not ready for this liberation, if Jews would have been thrust in one day from being in ghettos and being persecuted into an open world where they're invited into society and into the colleges and into this and that, this extreme change, like any person, if you do an extreme switch in your life, it's not good. Things are much better when they're done gradually. It was important for the Jewish people to gain freedom and to live like Jews are living today, in a sense, other than anti-Semitism, that there still is a lot. But other than that, Jews are basically free citizens all over, in most countries in the world in which we can live our lives and practice our religion and engage in business, engage other things. All the rights that exist for anyone else exist to the Jewish people. And not only that, Jews are highly successful and highly effective in this world. So, of course, this is the goal. But had the change been dramatically, that itself would have been at a cost, because Jews would not have known how to acclimate to that. And they would have been sucked up in the secular world. They would have been sucked up in the non-Jewish world. And very quickly, with the desire to adapt, because finally, for the first time, they're being kind of allowed in, so they would be embarrassed with their old-fashioned, so to speak, Jewishness, so they would kind of let go of it very quickly. All of that was part of the danger, but in addition to that, it was the spiritual poison and venom that was coming from a person who was an outright denier of God. The Alter Rebbe writes in a letter that if Napoleon is someone who doesn't believe in God completely, he takes all the credit in his words, which is a verse in Deuteronomy. My power and the strength of my arm has given me all my successes. He does not recognize a higher power. And the Alter Rebbe says that Alexander, the Russian, although he's an anti-Semite, but he's a devout Christian, he believes in God, and when he goes out to war, him and his soldiers pray to God for success, and therefore, between the two, it is better, at least back then in the 1800s, for Tsar was the Tsar's name? Alexander to win. So, now, by the way, it is known that not everybody of the rabbinic world, not all Jewish leaders were of the opinion or sided with the Alter Rebbe. There were other great Kabbalists and mystics and great saintly people who believed that Napoleon was going to herald Moshiach's coming to the world. And they believe that through Napoleon, they kind of saw him like a lot of people see Donald Trump, in the sense that he has a messianic role to play. So there were great tzaddikim who saw Napoleon as someone who's liberating Europe from oppression and so on and so forth, as kind of the forebearer who's like paving the road for the end of suffering for the Jewish people. Amongst them, some of the greatest Hasidic masters. I'm going to mention one of them, the holy and saintly Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Rimanovo, one of the greatest Hasidic rabbis of Poland. He was routing and fighting spiritually for Napoleon's win. But the Alter Rebbe had a very, very fierce opposite view. So much so that the Alter Rebbe felt that as Napoleon was beginning to make his advances into Russia, the Alter Rebbe felt that he will not allow himself to be under the same roof as Napoleon. When I say roof, I don't mean physical roof, but anywhere that Napoleon has kind of conquered, the Alter Rebbe did not want to stand in that territory. He felt that territory was contaminated. It was literally an impurity that he thought that he knew was so impure that he couldn't stand it. And he unleashed all of his, what we might call saintly tzaddik power, to us both spiritually in his battle on the spiritual side, and the evoking heavenly mercy to bring about Napoleon's defeat. And in addition to that, the Alter Rebbe actually assisted the Russian armies by embedding spies and having his Hasidim do whatever they can to help in the war effort. Now, in August of 1812, Napoleon crossed into Russia and began making advances. The Alter Rebbe then immediately packed up his possessions, his family, and him and a few wagons filled with 300 of his followers escaped the city of Liadi, and they started moving deeper into Russia, so that when Napoleon's armies will come in, he will not be there. So he ran from Napoleon deeper into Russia. Now, this ended up being a 140-day escape from Napoleon, and circling around deep in Russia. Now, that winter turned out to be ferociously freezing. And that journey of the Alter Rebbe is what in B'derech HaTeva, which means of natural causes, caused the Alter Rebbe to fall ill, and this is what he died 140 days later after he left in the city of Vienna on the 24th day of Teves, which is smack in the middle of the freezing winter. So here you have this great tzaddik who passes away on the road. Now, as the Rebbe explained this many times, the Alter Rebbe gave his life in this battle. The Alter Rebbe himself fought this war, as we spoke earlier, and he didn't have to run away. He could have stayed there. He could have welcomed Napoleon. Napoleon would have not harmed him. But because he felt that he's fighting him, so therefore, now it could be that Napoleon felt it. And it does, we do know some amazing story that when the Alter Rebbe ran away from his town, the Alter Rebbe instructed, the Alter Rebbe believed that Napoleon had certain black magic. He was a machashev. He had he was a sorcerer. He was involved in some dark stuff in that sense. And therefore the Alter Rebbe knew that Napoleon, if he manages to take a hold of an item, of a physical item that belonged to the Alter Rebbe, if he finds a sock, let's say, of the Alter Rebbe, or a spoon, or a plate, or one of his utensils, his cup, or that he made kiddush on, or something like that, if Napoleon would get a hold of one of these things, he would be able, with his impure powers, to harm the Alter Rebbe, or that would give him power to be victorious. I'm not exactly sure what the fear was, but to that end. So therefore, the Alter Rebbe instructed that every item in his house should be taken out. In other words, when they ran away, they packed everything. They didn't leave any belongings. They even uprooted the Alter Rebbe's lectern, his Schneur, where he would pray. It was attached to the ground. They uprooted it. They disconnected it from the ground because he didn't want to leave it for him. And in addition to that, there was a piece of carpet where the Alter Rebbe would stand when he would pray in his shul. The Alter Rebbe had them pull that carpet and not leave it because Napoleon would take that carpet. Lo and behold, the Alter Rebbe left, him and his whole entourage, and they also had like a few hundred Russian soldiers who came to 2 battalions, I think, that came to escort. They valued, the Tsar Alexander valued the Alter Rebbe's assistance. He knew that he's helping him, that he sent his soldiers to escort the Hasidim, this whole, as you call them, this whole entourage, or this whole, how do you call a bunch of wagons going somewhere? What do they call it? A caravan. This whole caravan that was leaving, he sent, it was escorted by. After the Alter Rebbe left town, he remembered, watch this, that there were some slippers that might have been left, old slippers that might have been left. He sent messengers to run back to his house to search for those slippers and grab him before Napoleon arrives. And then he said they should set his house on fire. Lo and behold, Napoleon's army, with Napoleon himself, came riding into Liadi. And Napoleon came running. He was asking, where does the great rabbi live? And he came running to the house, but the house was up in smokes. He then sent his soldiers out. Again, this is the story that is recorded, I think, by the previous Chabad Rebbe. He sent his soldiers out to search everywhere in the city if anybody has an item belonging to the Alter Rebbe. And he was going to give bribes. He was bribing, saying, give me something that once, but he didn't get anything. literally did not get anything. So just to show how much and how they recognized that we're at war with each other. Anyways, the Alter Rebbe is running deep into Russia. Now, the Alter Rebbe promised his family at a certain point, I'm exactly sure which days, I think these things are recorded, but I don't have all that information for you today. But the Alter Rebbe promised his Hasidim and promised his family that Napoleon is going to be defeated, and the Tsar and the Russians are going to turn the tide of the war. Now, because what happened in the beginning was, it was almost like when the Nazis came into Russia, they had a stunning victory in the early times of the war. They were moving right through Russia, and the Russians were being pushed back terribly, right? So the same was happening with Napoleon. The Russian army wasn't even fighting back. What the Russians were doing were just running and scorching the earth so that Napoleon's armies won't get in. Similar to what the Alter Rebbe did in Liadi, the Russian army was doing to all the things that Napoleon armies would come from place to place, and they wouldn't have food, they wouldn't have any whatever. This is what they were doing. Now, the decisive battle that began turning everything around happened on September 7th, 1812. Now, you can all do your verification. You don't have to listen. This is not that you have to trust me. Look it up, September 7th in history, you'll see the story. This was the greatest battle of all the Napoleon Wars. It happened in the town called 75 miles or kilometers, or miles or kilometers, I don't remember what it was, west of Moscow. There is a place, a town, or something called Borodino. And on September 7th, Napoleon launched the biggest attack ever to be able to break through the Russian line. It was one of the greatest battles in all of history. And I don't know the name of the battle itself, but I know the name of the place where it was fought, in Borodino. This is the first time that the Russians turned around and actually fought. It was one of the bloodiest battles ever. 70,000 people died in one day. About 35,000 French and another 45 Russian soldiers were killed. Technically, Napoleon won that battle because Napoleon then, a while later, entered into Moscow. But the fact that the Russians inflicted such damage on his army, and then just a week or 2 or 3 later, the Russians were able to regain strength and then drive Napoleon completely out of Russia. The tide turned and everything went the other way, and Napoleon had a tremendous, embarrassing and devastating defeat. But the consequential battle was this battle at Borodino on September 7th, and it actually, Napoleon's armies launched their attack under, I forgot the name of the general, at September 7th at 6 a.m. Now, what I would like to share with you is something stunning that happened that very day. September 7th, 1812 was the first day of the Hebrew year, the holy holiday of Rosh Hashanah, the day that God judges the world, and the day that we make God king over the world, and the coronation of the king, and the mitzvah of the day, the main commandment of how Jews celebrate and issue in the new year is by blowing the shofar. Now, we know that the blowing of the shofar is what directs, it's the birthing of the life force for the entire year. That's what the Kabbalists explain. It's like the shofar is like it's like a horn of an animal, but it's like a birth canal. Through the shofar, all the divine energy, the entire year, all the blessings and all the occurrences that are going to happen in the upcoming year is kind of drawn forth from the Almighty through the shofar. And that's why during those moments, we have enormous power to direct and bring about positive energy and blessings to the world. It's almost like unparalleled, the moment, and that's why it's the most serious moment in every Jewish synagogue. It's like the moment of the shofar. It's the deepest connection of the soul to God. It's this deep bond. It's the beginning. It's the kernel. For the great rabbis and mystics and saints, who had the deepest mystical knowledge and who understood a billion times more than us what the shofar is. And the fact that they were so righteous and great, when they would blow the shofar, they had the ability to direct, so to speak, God's energy in the way they wanted. So here is an amazing event that happened. On that morning, September 7th, 1812, the great tzaddik, now this story is told, when you read it, they say it in the name of a great Hasidic master known as Rabbi Yisrael of Koznitz, known as the Koznitzer Maggid. It's possible it was him. It's also possible it was the other tzaddik that I mentioned earlier, the other saintly rabbi known as Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Rimanov. It's one of these two. The reason I'm leaning more that it was Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Rimanov, because Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Rimanov was a powerful fan of Napoleon. And he was doing everything, as we mentioned earlier, spiritually for Napoleon's victory. The Koznitzer Maggid, who was a colleague of both the Alter Rebbe and of Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Rimanov, he was initially on Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Rimanov's side, but then he changed courses and he supported the defeat of Napoleon, and the Tsar should win the war. Okay, he had a change of heart at a certain point. So I don't know. It's possible it was him before he changed his mind, or it was Rabbi Mendel of Rimanov, but it was one of these two great tzaddikim, who knew that the shofar is going to decide. So either it was the holy saintly Rabbi Yisrael of Koznitz or Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Rimanov, who woke up Rosh Hashanah early morning and rushed through the morning prayers. You know that when do we blow the shofar? There are two primary prayers that we pray on Rosh Hashanah or on Shabbat or any special day. There's the morning prayer, and there's an additional prayer called the Musaf prayer, which is done a little. The morning prayer, usually Rosh Hashanah, can take 3 hours, and then the afternoon prayer, the middle prayer, the secondary prayer takes another 2-3 hours. In between these two prayers, that's when you blow the shofar. So let's say in a regular shul that starts praying usually, let's say 9 o'clock, so around 12 noon is when the shofar is blown. And that's when most people will blow the shofar. Give or take, a little earlier, a little later. Some will blow already at 11 o'clock, if they start praying a little earlier, depending on that. This tzaddik woke up early and zoomed through the morning prayers. Zoomed, literally. He went usually you sing, it's Rosh Hashanah, it's a time of meditation, you daven slow, you plead, you cry. You're producing the new year, and you're getting ready for the shofar. That takes you a while. But he went so quickly, literally said the words with enormous speed, because he wanted to blow the shofar on time. Early. He wanted to blow the shofar before anyone else, so that he can direct the victorious energy to Napoleon. So let's say at 9 a.m. he's already ready. Unheard of in his shul. Usually he would only be there at 12 noon. Now it's 9 a.m. They're all standing. He's ready to blow the shofar. He picks up the shofar. He's ready to make the blessing. And suddenly his hand starts shaking. Turns pale. He drops the shofar. And he said, "The Litvak beat me," in tremendous frustration and pain. He said the Litvak, it means the Lithuanian. That was the name that the other Hasidic masters referred to Reb Schneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of Chabad Hasidism. They referred to him as the Litvak because he was the one. Most of the Hasidic rabbis came from Poland and he was from deep in Lithuania. So they called him the Litvak. So he said, the Litvak beat me. What was the story? The story is the Alter Rebbe also had the same idea, that you got to blow shofar early morning. But the Alter Rebbe woke up in the morning, went to the mikveh, which means he dipped in the water at 6 a.m., gathered together a minyan, 10 people, and blew shofar before he started the morning prayers. In other words, technically shofar is a mitzvah, dependent. You don't have to do it then. Usually everybody does it between the shachris and the mincha and the musaf prayer. But the Alter Rebbe immediately in the morning, 6 a.m., gathered the minyan together, made the blessing, blew the shofar, directed all this energy towards the Tsar Alexander, his army to the Russian victory. You know which day that was? September 7th, 1812, 6 a.m. I don't know exactly the timing, but the story is the Alter Rebbe did it as early as he can. So it makes sense that Napoleon waited for daybreak. That's when he attacked. That's why he did it at 6 a.m. for daybreak. His army, literally 6 a.m., went off onto this attack. And that was the minute that the Alter Rebbe was blowing shofar. And the other great Hasidic master, hundreds of miles away, can sense that it's over. He has no power anymore. It's an incredible story. But what's crazy is you look up the dates, you see it's literally, even you can check it today, look up the secular recordings or Wikipedia, whatever it is, when the battle, the great battle in Russia, the biggest Napoleon attack ever took place, it was September 7th, then convert the date, September 7th, 1812, and you will see it is Rosh Hashanah of the year 5573. Sadly, the year the Alter Rebbe that year passed away a few months later. This was that victory. As we said earlier, the Alter Rebbe passed away. But before he passed away, I mentioned earlier that Napoleon made it all the way into Moscow. When he came into Moscow, there are letters. These are letters recording this. The son of the Alter Rebbe came to his father, the Alter Rebbe, the one who would be the next Rebbe, and he was crying and saying, "Father, you promised us that Napoleon is going to lose, and now he's already in Moscow." What happened was that whatever government, most of the Russian Tsarist government was in Petersburg, but there was some kind of Senate or whatever it was that had major offices or major presence in Moscow, and they all escaped and abandoned the city. So basically, it was almost like it was all open for Napoleon. So he was crying and said, "This has happened after Rosh Hashanah, like a week later, Yom Kippur time." And the Alter Rebbe and his family they heard the gunshots, they heard the gunpowder, they heard the sounds of the Napoleon, the shooting going. They weren't far from there. And he said, "Take a look what's happening." And his father said to him, "I swear," he made a shvuah, he took an oath that he is gonna fall, and you'll see that he's gonna. And lo and behold, a few weeks later, they say on the 19th of Kislev, which is about 4 or 5 weeks later, news got to this fleeing family that Napoleon has been driven out, and there is tremendous victories happening for the Russian army, and they're falling and falling and falling. Now, the Alter Rebbe, as I mentioned earlier, had embedded Hasidim to his people to be amongst the French army to snoop and to spy. He had a few Hasidim who spoke really well French, so they somehow managed, and they pretended to be whatever. I don't know exactly how it went about. When the news came to the Alter Rebbe that Napoleon was being pushed back, I think it was at that time, the Alter Rebbe asked the Hasidim, his people, "You were there closer to Napoleon's armies when they were crossing into Russia. Which song were they singing when they were?" So the Hasidim are always very musical. In Hasidic culture, there's a lot of singing. They picked up the song. So they sang the march that Napoleon's armies were marching to as they were marching into Russian territory. There's a famous song called Napoleon's March. It is sung in Chabad, especially the moments at the conclusion of Yom Kippur. At the Ne'ilah, after we finish the highest moment before we sound the Yom Kippur, we also blow the shofar one time, which is a sign that Yom Kippur is over. So right before that, there's a very lively tune sung called Napoleon's March. It's this march. And Hasidim dance like it's like no tomorrow. It's one of these powerful, powerful songs. So they sang this song to the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe said, indeed, this is a song of victory. And then the Rebbe went into a deep meditation. In Hasidus, it's called a dveikos. it says, I think he was leaning on a stick, and he went into a deep dveikus. It means his mind was like going somewhere. And he was lost in thought for a couple of minutes. And when he woke up from this trance, the Alter Rebbe said these words. Because he had said earlier that this is the song, before he went into the trance, he said it's a song of victory. And in Hebrew, he said it's a song of nitzachon. Nitzachon means victory. And now the Alter Rebbe said, in the end, it will be Didan Notzach, we will win. He said these words, Sof kol sof, Vedzain Didan Notzach, which means the end of the end, the very end will be that we will win. Now, I guess everybody standing over there interpret this to mean we will win this battle, we will win this war. What I'm here to suggest, and it implies from the Rebbe as well, from the talk the Rebbe gave in 1992 on Parshas Vayeshev, it implies that the Alter Rebbe was not only referring to the battle against Napoleon, but the Alter Rebbe was looking way, way into the future. And he said, it will be Didan Notzach, we will win. What does this mean? And here's amazing. I told you already and shared with you in the earlier classes that in Chabad, there is a holiday on the 5th day of Teves. Teves is the 10th month in the Hebrew calendar. It's the middle of the winter. Corresponding to an event that happened on January 6, 1987, where Chabad there was a great court case against the library of the Lubavitcher movement, in which family members of the Lubavitcher Rebbe were claiming that that library is private property and that therefore they have a rights to it, and it doesn't belong to the Chabad institution. And they were selling these books, and it went to the United States federal court. And on that day, January 6th, there was a victory. That day is referred to as the day of Didan Notzach, because the Rebbe implied these words, we won, we won. There's even an amazing song, a very happy tune called Didan Notzach. What I would like to suggest is when the Alter Rebbe said, in the end there will be Didan Notzach, means that the Alter Rebbe was referring to that victory of 1987. Because the Alter Rebbe had the first sight, the prophetic eyes, to recognize that this war that he won against Napoleon, he defeated Napoleon spiritually. It was clearly the Alter Rebbe's shofar that completely turned the tide around. Now, that this was a winning of a battle, but it didn't win the war. That this war would be a raging war that would go on, it would span more than 2 centuries. And in a sense, we can argue and say that this war is being fought literally now. We're the last crumbs of this war right now. Now with the news about Iran and it's all part of this one war. Let me explain. And that's why the Alter Rebbe uses the Didan Notzach, and we don't hear those words, Didan Notzach, till many years later when the Rebbe unpacks this, when the Rebbe brings to our attention this new holiday called Didan Notzach, we won. So to connect the dots, I'd like to say as follows. The Alter Rebbe, since he is the beginning of the seat of David, the return of the Davidic dynasty, what matters to the Alter Rebbe the most is God's sovereignty, which is in Hebrew, it's called Kabbalat Ol Malchut Shamayim, the acceptance of the divine kingship. If you read any literature from the Alter Rebbe, you'll be stunned. The Alter Rebbe is such an enormous spiritual giant. He discusses experiences of ecstasy, of bliss, of divine rapture, of excitement, of fervor, of passion, of experience, like we can't even begin to imagine. Yet, what dominates every single teaching of the Alter Rebbe, what you see it so clearly in so many things that I'm not going to go through examples right now, is that to the Alter Rebbe, there's always a question, there always has to be one ingredient there. Is it accompanied with fear of God? I don't care how much ecstasy you have. I don't care if you're flying through the roof with beams of light shooting out of your eyes, your ears, your nose, your flames of fire coming out of you. Do you fear God? Are you under the sovereignty of God? Are you accepting his kingship? And if God says, stop hollering and jumping and just sit quiet and listen to me for a moment, are you willing to be shut down that very second because God is your king and you have absolute obedience? Then it has value. If there's no fear of God over there, it's nothing. And it's so striking in the Alter Rebbe's teachings. Why? Because if the Alter Rebbe is the beginning of the return of the kingship, then kingship is the dominating element. And that's the reason why Napoleon is not kosher. The Alter Rebbe can take one smell and see, here is a man who does not bow his head in front of God. There is no fear of God at him at all. There's no subservience. There's no recognition of God's kingship. As I mentioned to you in earlier classes, Napoleon himself, you see, when the forces of unholiness are going to fight holiness, they can't just fight and dismiss the holy. They need to come with an alternative. They need to come with something that is similar to what holiness, to what the energy is. So Napoleon wasn't coming over here and saying, you know what, these messianic vibes, these Mashiach's vibes, forget about it, we're going to fight it. He needed to come with a message that was, in a sense, flowery and beautiful and speaking to having Mashiach vibrations to it, speaking to the emunah in Mashiach. We said earlier, Mendel of Rimanov said Napoleon was going to drive the redemption. And if you take a look at Napoleon himself, you see that he had so many ideas that were very messianic. Number one, the first idea, first of all, is liberating mankind from the oppression of the monarchs and all other governing. This is Mashiach. Mashiach comes to bring freedom to the world in many ways, to establish God's kingship, but to liberate and remove all oppression and all other taking advantage of people. But in addition to that, do you know that Napoleon wanted to set up a Jewish Sanhedrin, which means the restoration of the Jewish Grand Court that hasn't been in session since the days of the Second Temple? And he wanted to bring that back. He reached out to rabbis. He even created a French Sanhedrin in France. He made a semi-kind of Sanhedrin high court, which he, by the way, forced them to make amendments to those laws in Judaism that create a barrier between Jew and non-Jew, which creates separation. He wanted to mess with those barriers. You see that he didn't have clean intentions, but what I'm saying is there is Mashiach written all over Napoleon. He had that Mashiach aura. Problem with him was one point. He's trying to bring a world utopian Mashiach liberation and a Mashiach world without one simple point, and that is without God, or without the fear of God, without the obedience to God. And that's the essence of the anti-Mashiach force in this world. It's to remove the fear of God, the awe, not fear over here, but the awe of God, the surrender to God's will from the world. Now, as Napoleon was defeated, and eventually he was off the map, these forces of evil did not go to sleep. They continued and found other channels in which to rise up against holiness and to disturb the establishment of the foundations that were being built for Mashiach in this world by the Chabad Rebbes, by the Jewish people as a whole, by the Chabad Rebbes. And that's the reason. And another form, and it might have been more, I'm not going to go through everything, and I myself didn't study everything, but one of the main next, heirs to Napoleon were the Bolsheviks and the communists. And over here, as well as I mentioned in the earlier classes, they came and presented a utopian world, a world of sharing, a world of brotherly love, a world where there is no more poor and rich, where everybody's equal. It was like the communism on paper sounds like absolute heaven on earth. Problem is, it just doesn't work. It never worked. Its effects are totally the opposite. It destroys every country and every society that it was ever implemented. It doesn't work. But again, if you see communism, it's had at its, at least Russian Bolshevik communism and China as well, it has a fundamental allergy to God, to religion and to God. And therefore in all places, whether it's China, whether it's Russia and other places, there's always religious persecution. It's always people of God are the antithesis to the communist movements. And here again, where was the battle? It's almost like the Alter Rebbe defeated Napoleon of France. The Napoleon evil, the Napoleon darkness, the anti-Moshiach elements of Napoleon takes on a form, but this time it's in the territory of, it's born in Russia and it thrives in Russia and it takes over it's amazing. What Napoleon could not do to the Tsarist government, the Bolsheviks came and they overthrew. This is like second generation Napoleon. Again, I'm not making the connections necessarily of how Napoleon, Bolshevism, and communism are intertwined. Maybe someone can figure that out. However, when Napoleon tried to remove the Tsars, he accomplished it. He accomplished it in the form of communism coming and knocking off the Tsars, and completely reshaping the governance in Russia, taking over one of the terrible, bloody revolutions, and you end up with a massive atheistic, corrupted USSR. And who is their arch enemy? Enemy number one of the state? None other than the Schneersons, the Chabad Rebbes. We know when anybody had studied history, they immediately started shuttering down. They started fighting all religious institutions, but put special attention to the Jewish people. Tried to shut down all the institutions, all synagogues, all yeshivot, study halls, all chadarim, especially little children, shutting down the ritual baths, mikvahs, and all that. Everything was shuttered. It became impossible to be Jewish in Russia. To practice Judaism, to be an observant Jew in Russia, most of the great rabbis fled and just had to leave. It was impossible. But one person stood his ground. The sixth Chabad Rebbe of Yosef Yitzchak of Lubavitch. He was not going to run away. He was going to face the beast. And not only that, he created an army. He took his young men and young women, sent them out literally on a mission of Mesiras Nefesh meaning complete self-sacrifice, to the point of they exposed themselves and made themselves vulnerable to being caught, to being interrogated, to being tortured, to be literally tortured, but tortured like Russians knew how to torture, to being inflicted, to being sent away into the vast Siberian death camps. I mean, saying labor camps, which were literally death traps. It was very, very hard to come back alive, very unlikely. And these people were sent away 10 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and many of them didn't come home. Besides those, they were just taken right out in the cellars of these Russian prisons and just shot to death. And we're talking about in the hundreds. The hundreds of Chabad Hasidim died. They didn't have to. They died because they chose to be in the Rebbe's army, and they devoted their last ounce of blood for the continuity of Russian Jewry. The fact that there's Jewishness in Russia today is only because of the heroism of the previous Chabad Rebbe and of his numerous Hasidim who did incredible work. Well, the hammer came down, and in 1927, the previous Rebbe was arrested and sentenced to death. Miraculously, his death sentence was commuted to 10 years labor. Miraculously, the 10 years labor was commuted to 3 years exile. Miraculously, a week when he arrived in his place of exile, a week later, he was totally liberated. Absolutely stunning miracle from clearly God's miracle. The previous Rebbe had to leave Russia. But just in that time that he was imprisoned by them, I believe he literally, by the fact that he stood up like Napoleon and the Alter Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, with an incredible courage and God, and the fact that this is David versus Goliath in the literal sense, an entire Russian government ruling hundreds of millions of people with all their ferociousness is clamping down on one holy man. And he stands there and doesn't flinch. You read his diaries, it's stunning. The Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, took a dagger and thrust it right into the heart of the Russian beast. 70 years later, it collapsed. But the Rebbe already dealt that death blow back then. But in any case, even a dying beast was able to cause unimaginable suffering and pain for the continuity of Jewry in Russia and to the Hasidic movement that was in Russia. The Rebbe left in 1927, but his Hasidim stayed behind, fighting his battle, fighting what he stood for. In the end, the Lubavitcher Rebbe triumphed. There's no Soviet Union, and there is Chabad everywhere in Russia. Judaism in Russia is thriving like there's no tomorrow. These embers that were almost extinguished are coming. Even the Jews who were kind of disconnected are now returning in the millions in terms of connecting to Judaism. It's a miracle. That's one of the greatest miracles. The previous Rebbe won. Previous Rebbe passed away in 1950, so the communism did not fall till 1990. So the war was given over to his son-in-law, the next Rebbe, the Rebbe Menachem Mendel, the seventh Chabad Rebbe. Seventh Chabad Rebbe picked up where his father-in-law left off. And in addition to the Rebbe keeping Russian Jewry alive, do you know there's books describing that there were NKVD and KGB agents that would spy on the Rebbe in New York. The stories about it, how the Rebbe was very cautious, that he knew that the Russians are spying for him in New York because the Rebbe was considered such a powerful figure that the Russians needed to keep a watchful eye on him. And if you were in Russia, if you were in any way connected to Shneur, that was like capital crime. That was like the biggest offense you can possibly have, if you're somehow connected to Shneur. So the Rebbe keeps the battle from 1950 to 1990, and the Rebbe keeps, through an underground network, the Rebbe keeps in connection to the underground of Jews in Russia, supporting them, strengthening them, giving them the light. And only because of their connection to the Rebbe is what kept these people devoted and dedicated. He was their lifeblood and is their energy. Fine. But in addition to that, there were moments where you can see that, similar to the Alter Rebbe blowing shofar with Napoleon, you can see that the seventh Chabad Rebbe, our Lubavitcher Rebbe, was literally taking on the battle against the Russians in a very, very clear and open, conspicuous way. What was the battle? So first of all, in 1953, during the horrific times of Stalin, there was an incredible story that happened on Purim. Purim 1953. The Lubavitcher Rebbe is sitting by a Purim Farbrengen. Farbrengen is a gathering of the Hasidim. And the Rebbe is, the story really, I'm only telling you the literal crux of the story. You can look up Lubavitcher Rebbe with Stalin, Death of Stalin. You'll have long essays written on it. It'll tell you all the parts of it. There's a lot to it. I'm just zeroing in on the main point. During the Purim Farbrengen, the Rebbe used to sit hours and say talks and sing. The Rebbe had some really strange behavior. Towards the end of the Farbrengen, this is going like towards the early hours in the morning, 3 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., I'm not exactly sure. The Rebbe usually the Rebbe would say one Hasidic discourse at a Farbrengen. This Farbrengen, there were 2 Hasidic discourses. Now, Hasidic discourse is considered the highest level of divine channeling. The Rebbe would say a lot of talks, but a Hasidic discourse is like deep mystical ideas that are being brought into the world at that time. So that was unique about that. But in addition to that, the Rebbe told a story of his predecessor's predecessor, of the 5th Chabad Rebbe, Reb Shalom Dov Ber, that one time there was some kind of an elections taking place. I'm not exactly sure if this was still during the Tsar's days or during the Bolshevik time. I'm not exactly sure. And the 5th Chabad Rebbe was encouraging his Hasidim to go out and vote. So the Hasidim went to vote, and they knew which candidate they're voting for. The one that would be less anti-Semitic, more favorable for the Jews. Fine. Well, there was one Chassid, one of these followers of the Rebbe, who was a very devout Chassid, who had no idea about worldly matters. He didn't know, he never read the newspaper, didn't want to know what a newspaper looks like. He was just all day praying and learning and studying, and he was completely, like you say, detached from the outside world. It was like a real, aloof of aloof. Now, the Rebbe says you should go vote. He doesn't know what voting is. He doesn't know. But he knows if the Rebbe says to do something, he's doing it. But he's not doing it because in any sense of political sense, he's looking at this as something like a Rebbe said. So he's a follower of a Rebbe. So it's an act of holiness. So he goes to the mikveh. Before you're going to do something holy, you go to the mikveh, you immerse. He went and he put on what's called a gartel. It's a string you wear. When you go to do specifically, you're going to pray, you're going to do a mitzvah, you put on the string, you put it on your waist. It's kind of supposed to separate between your heart and your lower part of your body. And he washes his hands and he goes off to vote. Being that he doesn't know much who to vote what for, so he's standing over there and he's going with maybe other Hasidim, and the other Hasidim are telling him which lever or which, I don't know how they vote, what to push or what to, which to put his scrap of paper or whatever it was over here or put it over there. He was just kind of going along, not knowing what, where, and when. Meanwhile, outside the voting booth, there were a bunch of young people who were chanting for their candidate. And they were very sure that one candidate was going to win, and they were singing and they were chanting, hooray, hooray. But hooray, hooray in Russian, again, I don't speak Russian, was kind of sounding more like hoorah, hoorah, hoorah. Now this guy, a simple person that he is, he hears them saying hoorah, hoorah, hoorah. He thinks they're telling him to dance to hoorah. No, he's thinking that in Hebrew, hoorah means he is bad. It's two words. Hoorah, he is bad. Okay, so we're working with three languages. Hooray in Russian is somehow some Russian chant of hoorah. And the hoorah, if you in Hebrew say it, means hoorah, he is bad. This guy maybe didn't even speak Russian much. He just spoke Yiddish and Hebrew. He hears hoorah, and so he thought it was interesting. So he joins these people and he's yelling as well, hoorah, and he's intending he's bad, and he's getting excited and he's joining hoorah. The Rebbe is telling the story, and while the Rebbe is telling the story, the Rebbe is going hoorah, hoorah, and the Rebbe seems to be turning to the Hasidim, like with his hands, kind of asking the Hasidim to join in wrong. And suddenly 770 packed with the Hasidim, I don't know, a few hundred Hasidim there, everybody starts yelling together, hoorah, hoorah. And all the people that were there were witnessing, felt that something heavenly is taking place over here. The Rebbe is not making jokes over here. There's something going on. And the Rebbe, I think the Rebbe told the story twice, I'm not sure, but there was something like magical in the moment that you can see that what the Rebbe was sitting in 770, but his eyes and his neshama, his soul, could have been thousands of miles away somewhere else. You can see that a tzaddik is not in this world and he's doing something. Everybody that was there felt it. Anyways, no one knew what's going on. Fine, this is March 1st. Suddenly, a day or two later, now, Purim, 1953, was March 1st. By March 5th, it was announced in Russia that Stalin had died, suddenly died. And everybody knows Stalin's death is shrouded in mystery. There's movies made about it. Turns out that in March 1st is when he had a stroke, according to most. And then a few days, the Russians were trying, he died, I don't know when exactly he died. They were trying to hide it, that he was like the great supreme leader. Everything was Stalin. Finally, on March 5th, they came out that he died. And then people put it together. Now, what's important to know, that right at that time, Stalin was in the midst of readying to prepare for something extremely dirty and extremely vicious. If you read up on it, I don't want to read the whole story, but there was at that time a tremendous blood libel against the Jewish people. A whole group of Jewish doctors were accused of poisoning Russian officials. The whole thing was a fabrication, and the whole thing was made just for the point to create and incite anti-Semitism and pogroms all over Russia. And then Stalin would come, listen to that, the viciousness of it. He had a whole plan. that Stalin was going to come and save the Jews from being beaten in the buses, from being beaten on the streets, because they had propaganda going in newspapers and television all day long saying one thing, or in radio, that the doctors, Jewish doctors, they made sure to keep on saying Jewish doctors, had a plot to kill all the Russian elites, Mother Russia, to destroy and this was supposed to create great animosity and hatred. And then Stalin would come and save the Jewish people by offering that he's going to send them to a safe place, like Hitler was going to send all the Jewish people also to a safe place for rehabilitation, to the gas chambers. Stalin was preparing to send all of them to Siberia, have them all die. So many of them would die on the road. He had a whole calculation. It was all supposed to happen. The trial of the doctors, everything was it would have been a fake trial. It would have been a kangaroo trial. The whole thing would have been fake. It was all supposed to go down right after that Purim. And the Rebbe did a spiritual assassination in 1953. So I'm just giving you a story where you see the communism as Napoleon kind of continuation, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe being the powerful force that is fighting it on so many different levels. Fast forward 1982, 1983. I mentioned in the earlier classes. At a certain point after Stalin, I don't know, I'm not going to go through all the leaders, because I don't know it right now, and I didn't take the time to write it down, but all this information is online. You can look it up. At a certain point, someone by the name of Brezhnev was premier in Russia. And he was not like Stalin. No one can beat Stalin, but he wasn't the best guy. And Jews continued suffering under his... He was in power like 20, 30 years. In 1982, he suddenly died. He was replaced by Khrushchev. Khrushchev died in 1984. Khrushchev was succeeded by someone, Chernenko, who lived also only for a year and died in 1985. So suddenly, mysteriously, 3 Russian premiers are dying, which seems to be without explanation. I mentioned already in the earlier classes something really astounding, that at least by 2 of them, in 1982, which was and in 1984, the first 2 of them, Brezhnev and Khrushchev, both of these, before they died, 2-3 months before that, on Rosh Hashanah, go back to Rosh Hashanah where the Alter Rebbe blows shofar and decides heavenly energies, the Rebbe, during his Farbrengen, during his talks, mentioned something very powerful. That his great-grandfather, known as the Tzemach Tzedek, the 3rd Chabad Rebbe, the grandson of Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, the one that we told the story about him being hiding in the oven, it was known by the Hasidim that on Rosh Hashanah he would dictate who's going to be minister in Petersburg. The words Hasidim would use, the Tzemach Tzedek, Macht Seder in Peterburg. The Rebbe is making order in Petersburg. He's deciding who he wants to minister, who's going to lose the election, or is going to die, or so on and so forth. Because in that anti-Semitic world, you needed to really choose your the best of the worst. The whole clan was rotten to the core. But to get your best, the one who will be the most tolerant of the Jewish people. The Tzemach Tzedek would make order. Now, Hasidim knew that if the Rebbe, every word of his mouth is so careful, the Rebbe never said anything extra. Every word was counted. Everything is holy. Especially Rosh Hashanah, when you're supposed to be so careful. Any person is supposed to be careful with every sentence, everything sensitive. When the Rebbe would mention this on Rosh Hashanah, means that the Rebbe was then doing the same work like his great-grandfather did. In 1982 and in 1984, which are the years, let me tell you which years they are. They're the year 5783 in the Hebrew year, and the year 5784. In both these years, Tafshin Mem Gimel and Tafshin Mem Daled, it's in these 2 years you can look up in the Rosh Hashanah Farbrengen. One is in Mem Gimel, it's on Rosh Hashanah, and in Mem Daled, it's Erev Rosh Hashanah, the day before Rosh Hashanah, the Tzemach Tzedek's yahrzeit, the day that Tzemach Tzedek passed away. In these 2 days, on these 2 dates, the Rebbe mentions how the Tzemach Tzedek would make Seder in Petersburg. And the Rebbe says how a Jew has the power to organize things. And Hasidim knew at the time that there's going to be news. Something is going to happen in the world soon. And guess what? We found out later. This one died, the next one died. What that really means, that the Rebbe did a spiritual assassination. There is no question. 1, 2. The third one died a year later. I don't have evidence that the Rebbe spoke about it on Rosh Hashanah. Maybe someone can find it to me. I did some look, I didn't see it. But at least the first two. But Chernenko dies a year later. Maybe the Rebbe knocked both of them off in the year before. I'm not exactly sure. I don't want to say anything that I don't have clear evidence of. But the moment Gorbachev took over in 1985, Chernenko died in 1985, March, I think March 11th. And I think the next day or something like that, Michael Gorbachev. Now, we know Gorbachev was the one who Reagan said, take down the wall. And Gorbachev was the one who led the USSR to its total dissolvement. He completely he undid the entire apparatus. This entire monstrous government was suddenly completely dismantled under Gorbachev. So I told you already the story. I'm going to say it quickly again. As when Gorbachev was appointed premier of Russia, it was in March of 1985. In April 1985, listen to this. In April 1985, a month later, the Rebbe contacted a Russian refusenik by the name of Professor Bronover, who had come out of Russia, not exactly sure which year, but not too long before that. And the Rebbe, he was a Chabad chassid, the Rebbe contacted him. He came to America to give a talk or whatever, and the Rebbe contacted him and told him, the Rebbe told the secretary to speak to the Jews in Russia and tell them that soon the Iron Curtain is going to open up, which was unbelievable. People couldn't even begin to imagine that would ever happen. And that the millions of Jews of Russia will be free, will be allowed to leave. It was, the Rebbe gave that prophecy. It's astounding, and I mentioned this already in an earlier class, that later Gorbachev himself was told about this, and Gorbachev almost fell off his chair. He said, I can't believe it, because in 1985, I wasn't even dreaming of this. So the Rebbe knew what Gorbachev would be doing even before Gorbachev even thought of it. The idea didn't even occur to him that he would be making these moves. He said, I had certain ideas of modernization, but I did not in any way plan for this. Yet the Rebbe knew his man is there. So what I'm going to say is very amazing. By the time 1985 came along, the Rebbe had already destroyed the entire Russian communist thing. Again, he did the first blow with Stalin. And in 1980s, 82, 83, and 84, boom, boom, 3 assassinations, if you might say, 2 at least. And then finally, the Rebbe has his man there who's going to make the transition, who's going to turn it all over. Victory. This incredible force of darkness is gone. What starts with Napoleon is done. And why in this time, can I add? I'll take you back to class number 3. Remember in class number 3, we spoke about the window? That the window of redemption, particularly the gates, there is an end time of Daniel that says 1982, the 1,290 years. If you don't know what I'm talking about, please listen to part number 3. So there we discussed that in 1982, Daniel prophesizes is going to be, again, I'm not saying this as absolute, but everything is leading to this. Plus, the Rebbe himself endorsed that in 1982, Tavshin Mem Beis is the Kates, the great Kates. Kates is end time, which it says that Moshiach has to come by 1290 years after something despicable has been placed. And we discussed means the mosque, which people corrected me a lot in the comments. I by mistake said 682, the year 682, the mosque was made. The Al-Aqsa Mosque on the place of our holy temple. But it's really 692. If you do from the year 692, which was the year it was completed, 1290 brings it to 1982. So that's the time of Mashiach, revealing himself already. So Mashiach is going to start doing some really pretty cool stuff. He has to eliminate evil. That happens 1983, 1984, 1985. Boom, 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 Mashiach's cannons. It's huge. And remember, we learned over there there's going to be but then there's a 45 years period where there is a concealment and a hiding, and there's still which we're still going to talk about in future classes. Why this darkness that follows this first revelation of Mashiach? Like Rashi says, Mashiach will be revealed, and then for 45 years he will be concealed. And that's from 13. And remember, the 1335 ends this year and next year. Really, next year, 5687. But we're there. We're at the zone now. It's like unbelievable. So we can understand why it's exactly at that time that the entire apparatus of evil is literally being shattered and broken by the Davidic dynasty, by Malchus Beis Dovid, by these powerful forces of establishment of Yireh Shamayim and God and mitzvahs across the world and so on. So what do you think? You think the Klippa is going to go down without a fight? You think the Klippa is just going to say, hey, Lubavitcher Rebbe, Klippa meaning the forces of shells, the forces of darkness, the Chitzonim, the other side, is just going to say, hey, Lubavitcher Rebbe, you're messing with us and you're super cool. We're kind of watching it all happen. No way. So here is where the last part of the story, and it gets so amazing. Because in this context, suddenly that entire story becomes incredible. Remember I told you that there was a fight about the books. How did this whole thing land in court? The Chabad librarians who own this ancient library, brought by their predecessor, the Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, when he came out of Russia. Not him, just him and his fathers had collected an enormous amount of books and manuscripts, priceless. And when the previous Rebbe had to flee Russia as a result of his arrest and all of that, some of it they managed to take some of it out, some of it stayed. A lot of books are still in Russia now, but a massive amount of that library came to New York. And then the previous Rebbe continued collecting in America as well and increasing his library. And the Rebbe too was increasing that library. But what happened is some family member, the Rebbe's nephew, the Rebbe's wife's, the Rebbetzins' sister's son, what happened was the librarians started noticing that in the library, certain valuable books of very high value were missing. And after they just started doing a little research, and I think that it even became known to them that they were being sold by antique dealers. It somehow got to I don't know at which point they found out, maybe at this point or maybe later, but it got to them that antique dealers are selling certain books, which they knew was from the library. I think one of the antique dealers even contacted the library and saying that we got a book. I think that's what happened. Anyways, they noticed it. And they didn't know. It was a shock. They didn't even want to tell the Rebbe. They told the Rebbetzin, the Rebbe's wife. They didn't want to aggravate the Rebbe and they decided that they're going to put a hidden camera. The Rebbetzin was the one who gave the authority. They should put a hidden camera. And they knew that the person who's coming in knows when to come, because he was coming in only at the time during the Rebbe was giving Farbrengens, where everybody's attention was put to the Rebbe. He said he was coming into the library. They didn't know who it was, but then they got the camera, and it was none other than the Rebbe's nephew. And it made it very painful. It was the Rebbe's own family. The Rebbetzin only had, the Rebbe's wife only had, Rebbetzin had only one sister who survived. She had another sister who died in the Holocaust, and they were like so close. And now her son is stealing books from the library. It created a wedge in the family. It was one of the most heartbreaking stories. It was terrible. Anyways, and then this story became a full-blown, literally, war. And it went to the courts and lasted for 2 years. And in 1987, on January 6th, the 5th day of Teves, the Rebbe won. Basically, the court case was won to the favor of Chabad. And what was the argument? Are the books the private property of the previous Lubavitch Rebbe, and therefore it belongs to his heirs? His grandson, who is a descendant, has a right to at least claim half of it or part of it, and therefore, and if he wants to sell it, he'll sell it. or if belongs to the Hasidic movement, and then it's not owned by private people. That was the argument. It was a lengthy fight in court, and as I mentioned to you, the Rebbe turned this into this seemingly family feud. If you witness that the Rebbe spoke about it as if this is a cosmic war of good and evil. And it was, I know a lot of people don't get it. And I'm like, why? What is the Rebbe talking about over here? Why is this? It's a family fight. Why is this a cosmic war of good and evil? If you listen to the Rebbe, you see that the Rebbe said and expressed himself. The Rebbe had enormous pain. And the Rebbe said that what they are contesting is not the books. They are contesting, they're fighting this chair, which means they're fighting the throne. Meaning they're fighting the idea that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the seventh Rebbe, is the successor of his father-in-law. What that really means is they were trying to delegitimize the Lubavitcher Rebbe as being the Rebbe, which in other words means, in the context of what we were talking about, to dethrone the king. Now, Barry is a player. He's just one person. What we realize, this is what I'm trying to convey in all these classes, that when humans are doing certain things, not always they're acting on behalf of their own. They're emissaries through which spiritual energies are coming through. So if a dark force wants to come in, now why would they do that? You see, as soon as the Rebbe took down the kings of the Klippa, as I mentioned earlier, Stalin is out, Napoleon was out by the Alter Rebbe, Stalin is out, as we say, Brezhnev, Khrushchev, this one, that one, and the Rebbe is like, boom, boom, boom. They're not going to sit there quietly. It's a game of chess. They're coming after our king as well. So their idea was to take the Rebbe down completely by delegitimizing him. This is what this battle was about. When did it start? And here is the crunch. It starts exactly in November, December, January of 1985. November, December of 1984, January 1985. Exactly as the point when that last ruler of Russia is off and Gorbachev becomes ruler. That's when, by the way, the Rebbe didn't speak about it publicly until the summer of 1985, which means till after Gorbachev is already in office. The Rebbe spoke about it like with such pain. And here is the catch of all of this. I'm going a little longer today than the other classes because this is just something. This is in honor of the Alter Rebbe's yahrzeit. The Rebbe told a story. This is goosebumps. During that time, the Rebbe was quoting an interesting midrash. There's a midrashic story in Vayikra somewhere. It's also a midrash Tanchum and it's a midrash Rabbah. There's a story, and the Rebbe was, this whole song, Didan Notzach, we won. Where did it come from? So the Rebbe gave a few talks, and the Rebbe brought down a midrash. A Rebbe a lot of times hints to things. He's hinting, and he hopes that we will figure things out. The midrash tells a story like this, that there was a rabbi, his name was Abba Yossi. Abba usually means, either meant it was his name, Abba, or Abba can a lot of times mean the great Yossi, from which city? I forgot which city. This Abba Yossi, who outside of his city there was a well. And one time he was sitting by the well, and a spirit revealed himself to him. A spirit, a demonic spirit. And the spirit says to him, listen here, Rabbi Yossi, I want to tell you something. He says, I'm the spirit who dwells on this well. I'm here. Do you know that all the years that I've been sitting here, no one in the city was harmed? Even when people come alone, we spirits, we like to mess with people when they're alone. No, people come here, even at night, men, women, children, and even when they come at night, they're never harmed. You never had anybody walk away with a bloody nose or trip and fall or whatever, which all can be done by a demon who's messing with people, which was very, very common in those days. And you know why? Because I'm a very peaceful demon. I'm a nice guy. I don't mess with anybody. You leave me alone, I leave you alone. We're all good. But I have bad news, he says. I have very bad news. This is the story the Rebbe is telling. The Rebbe is telling from the Midrash. I have bad news. There is another sheriff who's coming to town. Another demon wants to evict me from this mayan, from this spring. He wants to take over. Now, he's a nasty guy. If he kicks me out of here, you guys are going to have trouble. You're going to see people are going to be harmed. It's going to become a nightmare to get water. So you're better off keeping me here. So he says, yeah, but I'm not going to stick my head into a fight amongst demons. What are we going to do? Elections? We're going to elect this demon over the other demon? No, he says, you don't have to do that. I'll tell you what to do. Go back to town. Go around, tell everybody to be ready for tomorrow morning. Early morning before sunrise. Be there with the entire town outside of the spring. It's a very strange story in the Midrash, by the way. And everybody should bring pots and pans. Anybody has a pot and a pan and another, any kind of banging material, like a drum circle. Anybody that can find anything that can bang and make noise, bring these noise makers, men, women, and children. When you will see, look at the water when the sun rises. And when you will see that it starts being ripples in the water, like it looks like someone is missing with the water, you should know that a demon has arrived. He's scouting out. He's coming to check out the place. He's arriving. He's coming to stake claim on the water. At that moment, your entire and everybody that's there should start banging and making noise and shouting, Didan Notzach, we won, we won, we won, Didan Notzach. And when you shout, we won, which is a cry of victory, and don't stop until you will see, I think he said 1 drop of blood or 2 to 3 drops of blood on the water, and you'll know you killed him. He's done. The Midrash goes ahead and says, not only that, the Midrash doesn't just say this is what they did, the Midrash repeats the whole thing. Abba Yossi went back, spoke to the people came the next morning, they stood there early morning with the pots and pans, the demon, they saw the water, and then everybody dealt Didan Notzach, and lo and behold, boom, they broke the demon. There was the blood, and everybody lived happily ever after. That's the story that the Rebbe relates. Now, does that make, like, first of all, the story doesn't make any sense, but why is the Rebbe telling us? And the Rebbe is saying, from there we see that to break evil, we have to claim victory. When we tell evil we won already, that's when we're singing a marching tune that Didan Notzach, we won, then he knows he doesn't stand a chance. He's done. It's a weird story. What does it have to do with the book? With the books and the Rebbe fight against the books? So you see that this is a cosmic, the Rebbe is telling us this is a much bigger story. You see, the first ruach, the first spirit that's over the water, is referring to ruach elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim. Right at the beginning of the story of the Torah, it says the spirit of God is hovering over the water, and the Midrash tells us that's the spirit of Mashiach. Dam melech HaMashiach, that's Mashiach's spirit hovering over the water. This Midrashic story is really referring to that ruach, but that's that's Mashiach's spirit. And the Rebbe is saying that there are powerful dark forces that want to dethrone Mashiach, want to give us another Mashiach, as we say, whether it's Napoleon, whether it's the Bolsheviks, whether it's the communists, whether it's whatever it's manifesting in these who are trying to delegitimize. And I need help, the Rebbe is saying, I need help. All of you come and declare that we won. Imagine. Declare we won already. And you will make that declaration and we will win. And lo and behold, 1987, Hague Teves was the victory. Now, if you begin to realize, first of all, that day became like crazy. The singing, the dancing, just the amount of liquor that drank. The Hasidim went nuts with celebration. It was like, because people saw how much aggravation it gave the Rebbe. And the Rebbe encouraged it. There was also some rebuke, but mostly it was tremendous encouragement. And then the Rebbe like drove that we should learn, study more. And the Rebbe called the holiday Didan Notzach, we won. May I say that declaration was the final victory? Moshiach has risen his flags. In essence, the victory of Moshiach. And then later, you see, 2-3 years later, the communist regime falls. Now, you understand something. When victory happens in holiness, it might take many years until it will manifest on the outside. You know, Iran falling tomorrow and Venezuela falling now and last week. And these is all part of a chain of reaction, all related to that one victory. That's what Didan Notzach Teves is the final victory. And now I take you back to the Alter Rebbe. When the Alter Rebbe was leaning on the stick and he said, when he heard the march of Napoleon, and he said, in the end, it will be Didan Notzach. He was referring to Didan Notzach in the end. In 1987. This is one long battle. Now, to prove the idea that that 1987 Didan Notzach was a pivotal date in the victory of holiness over the unholy, in which a death blow was finally dealt to the Klippa. And by the way, it wasn't just, it had to be the United States of America's federal. Because what did we say? What were the Chabad Rabbeim supporting in terms of Tikkun Olam? America. So America had to agree, in a sense, to legitimize the Rebbe. It wasn't, the Rebbe doesn't need legitimate, he needed, the world itself should accept its king, in a sense. That's the deeper story here. It's crazy. But now we'll also understand why fast forward 5 years later, after 1986, in 1992, on that very anniversary of the Hebrew date Hey Teves, was when the USSR they signed the Belveja, I forgot the name of the Belveja, what was it called? Yeah, the Belveja Accords, which was the official dissolving of the government of the USSR. Like, is this not clear? The same date, 5 years later, gone. The Rebbe made note of it. And even more spectacular, the chain of evil that we are watching collapsing now, the entire apparatus of Iran and all. Because let's understand something, and I'm gonna add just this one point, and then next class we'll pick up further. But here's is like amazing. Once Moshiach already is holding on to his throne and no one can evict him from his throne, so we have already Moshiach on his throne. The next achievement is going to be the building the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Moshiach now has to bring the Jewish people to Israel and build the Holy Temple. So nothing starts before Moshiach is established. Once Moshiach is established, then Moshiach builds the temple. So the next theater, watch this is so amazing. The next theater of battle, the battle ended against the Rebbe. But the battle now is going to start against the Holy Temple. Because now, what did the Rebbe say at I shared this with you just a few weeks, just in one of the classes. The next Shabbos after January 6th, 1987, after Hey Teves, Tavshem Mem Zayin, the Rebbe himself said that we finished everything. Now we have to go out with an announcement to the entire world. What's the announcement? We have to tell everybody that there's nothing left now other than Imdu Hachin Kulchem, stand ready to the building of the temple. So now we can, the Rebbe shines the light on the temple. Where are all the klippos, the remaining klippa, the remaining forces of evil? Where are they going to now focus their attention? The next thing is going to be free Palestine. And that's exactly when the whole Palestinian movement started. It was there earlier, but it never picked up steam. In the 1990s is when the Intifada started, when everything, because it stopped being a moment of rush. It wasn't no more a war of atheism against the belief in God. Now it became about, Jews being, colonials and stealing the land and land. In other words, don't build the Holy Temple. That's what it is all about. It moves to there. Wait, but the victory of the 5th day of Teves carries over to that battle as well. Because this is all built around Iran. Iran becomes remember we said, actually, you got France, you got Russia, you got this family fight going on against the Rebbe, which is all the continuation of that. Finally, now it becomes the Islamic countries getting support by the UN, getting support by the European Union, getting support by the American left, It's all like coming together as an enormous, team that's all fighting against Israel and against the Jewish people's right to the Holy Temple. That entire apparatus of evil is falling and crumbling. The first domino that was flicked like this, that fell, which is knocking over all the other dominoes, was the killing of Qasem Soleimani. He was the brain of the entire axis of evil, of the entire Iranian. It was all Qasem Soleimani. And President Trump, may he be blessed, took him out courageously on the 5th day of Teves, 2020. I don't know. If anybody wants to argue on all of this, go ahead. If you want to keep your head in the sand and not see anything, go ahead. I bless you. To me, everything is lining up. Everything is so clear. I see everything is one puzzle all coming together. And just wait. Bezrat Hashem, for the last 2 final classes, Bezrat Hashem, in this series, we're going to continue the deeper elements of all of this, leading us to where we are now. I give a big blessing. Iran should fall today. The wicked regime of it, all this darkness should crumble and fall down. Shouldn't have to wait another half a moment for the coming of Moshiach. We're ready right now. But I think this is very encouraging, very uplifting, and very meaningful. So thank you for bearing with me, learning with me. And Be'ezrat Hashem, we shall continue another class tomorrow night.